Well, good morning, everyone. It's such a pleasure to be here to talk to you a little bit about some of the challenges we face as seagrass people working here in Southeast Asia. This is a really exciting region to be in. There's a lot going on. We have spectacular seagrass meadows, but it's a really heavily coral-centric one. And those of us who work on seagrass have had to figure out ways of coping with the apparent blindness that people have towards seagrass. Everyone wants to go to the coral reefs. They get all the attention in terms of funding opportunities and media attention. And seagrass scientists here, well, in Malaysia at least, are left with almost nothing. So, I guess this never used to be apparent when threats against seagrass were not as widespread. But now we do know that if we fail to capture public attention anytime soon for seagrass, there will be severe repercussions on the future of this very important ecosystem. So there have been some of us who've been trying to shift the focus towards seagrass in this region. Miguel Fortes, working out of the Philippines, for example, in 1989, synthesized everything known about seagrass at that time. He talked about their distribution, how we use them as resources, threats to them, and what the management opportunities were. And this was in his monograph, Seagrasses, a Resource Unknown in the ASEAN Region. It really was practically unknown at that time. And then 20 years later, Unsworth and Cullen made the same call for attention to seagrass, as did I and my collaborators in Australia and Malaysia. And more recently, just a few weeks ago actually, some of us in the region got together. That's Miguel Fortes from the Philippines, Tanyu May and Siti Mariam from Singapore, Anchana from Thailand, Japa Sirit Bujang and myself from Malaysia. We got together to pool our collective vision for seagrass in the region. And you know what? The same message still resonated through, that there was limited understanding about seagrass. The public didn't really know about it. There was not a lot of attention to it. And now was the time for us to bridge the gap between our scientific intellectual understanding of seagrass with the public's perception of it. So I was asked to give this talk about some of the work I do, apparently as a fairly new seagrass person working in this region. But really the overarching theme for this talk will be how the blindness that I see towards seagrass has shaped and reframed my research direction. So let me start by walking you through our study site. I work mostly in the Mersing Marine Park Island. This is in the little red box down here, and that consists of 13 islands, all of which were gazetted as Marine Park Islands in 1994. So these are total no-take zones, no extraction activities at all. So zooming in, these are all the islands that you see in the blue boxes, all that lie within the broader Mersing Marine Park Islands. But the group of islands that I work on most, and which most of the studies that I'll be showing you about are situated in, would be the Cebu Tinggi group of islands. So Cebu is the name of this island down here, and Tinggi is the name of this larger island over here. If I show you this Google imagery, you'll see that most of the seagrass meadows actually are forereef seagrass, in the sense that they don't actually occur on the fringing coral reefs like most of the other meadows from which the scientific literature consists of. They actually occur on the seaward side of the fringing coral reefs. And they're really pretty extensive. So if you look at this, you'll see a fringing coral reef flat here that's about 150 meters wide. You'll see a halo, a bare sand strip there, followed by the forereef seagrass that occurs in water depths of 3 to 8 meters. And this is what it looks like underwater there. These are the 4 main species that we have up there. I've always put them down as Halophila ovalis complex, but very recently, just last week actually, I was told by Vincent Liu from Sun Yat-sen University in Taiwan that actually he thinks it's Halophila major after he ran some ITS sequences on them. And John Kwok many years ago also thought that it might actually, the Halophila here might actually be Halophila major. So Halodula uninervis, Cymadosa cerulata, Syringodium isoetifolium. There's no inhalers. It's just too deep for inhalers, and there's also no thalassia. So all these are structurally simple pioneer species that dominate this entire meadow. So what do we know about these meadows? Well, from the work that I did under Gary Kendrick at the University of Western Australia, We know that although they occur in very well-mixed meadows, I mean, if you dig into them, the rhizomes are intertwined, you know, the root matrix is almost intertwined, everything's growing together, they share a common space. But we were still able to tease out that each species actually had very individual and very distinct spatial structure. And we did this by running variogram analysis on them, and we extracted the parameters from the variogram models to try to identify the types of processes or the distances of processes at which each species was being influenced. And it was very different for all these species, even though they were growing together. For example, for Halophila ovalis, Halophila and Halodule, they were both very similar. They were both influenced by some broad scale process operating at more than 50 meters in the alongshore and more than 140 meters in the across-shore. But these were the variances explained at those distances. But for other species, it was really different. If you look at Syringodium, there was really nothing here in terms of the broad scale, but it was actually influenced by the fine scale processes. And then Cymodocea was influenced by micro scale and broad scale. So they were growing together, but obviously responding to some common process in different ways or responding differently to different processes. And the variograms don't tell us what the processes are. It just helps us to recognize that there are patterns. So what were those processes? Well, we didn't really know, but we were interested in the micro scale, because if you look at the micro scale here, the models told us less than 2.5 meters. The species were responding to that distance. And the same thing in the cross-shore direction, they were responding to something operating at distances of 2.5 meters. So we wondered, we looked around us, we wondered, so what are those processes? And the thing that we all saw was there were a lot of thalassinid shrimp mounds. So maybe burial, maybe sediment burial is something that's influencing all these different species in different ways. So we ran some experiments on them. We looked at how much should density and biomass decline after being buried under 2 centimeters, 4 centimeters, 8 centimeters, and 16 centimeters of sediment for 27 days. And we severed the rhizomes to cut them off from other shoots that were outside the burial pot because, well, number one, this was the way most of the burial experiments had been run by Carlos Duarte, for example, in the Philippines, in Bolinao. So we did that. We tried to standardize what was within the burial plots. And as expected, they didn't do very well. By the end of it, there was hardly anything left. And then we thought, you know, maybe this isn't a really natural thing to do. Normally, when natural burial happens, shoots that are unburied will translocate resources to shoots that are buried. So meaning that survival actually should be boosted. It shouldn't be as bad as this. So we had another set of experiments where we left the rhizomes intact. And yep, they were more hardy than we thought they were. They may have declined in terms of biomass and shoot density, but they were still there, hanging on, even after 27 days. I mean, for Halophila ovalis, I think it's amazing because the barrel depth was sometimes 300% higher than the tallest shoot of its canopy. So these are hardier species than we think they are in terms of their response to burial. And then we also looked at their distribution across the environmental gradient to look at how they responded to different sediment variables, to water depth as a proxy for light. And these are just some of the response curves that I put out here. But it showed us some very interesting things. It actually showed us that Halophila and Halodule uninervis actually responded pretty well to all the sediment variables we had and to water depth. And we also could see that the optima for Halophila, which is the black line, and Halodule uninervis, which is the gray line, their optima were always very, very similar. So this matched, I think, some of the responses that I saw in some of your presentations recently, where those two species always respond in very similar ways. And our models show that they do respond in similar ways in terms of their ecological niche. Cymodocea cerulata was the other species we modeled, but that was like an entirely different creature. It didn't respond to anything. It was significant, okay, towards inorganic carbon, but really it's almost a flat line, so we didn't really regard it as being a really important response. It didn't really respond to anything, so we're like, oh, okay, so Cymodocea is really different, and we didn't know how to deal with that. But then we thought, well, maybe because they're growing intertwined together, maybe there's some interspecific reaction happening. So we looked at the below ground biomass, we plotted the curves, this time with the below ground biomass of co-occurring species, and we found that the variances explained for Cymadosia cerulata in particular more than doubled. So, well, we thought, well, this was really interesting because this actually means that Cymadosia, as well as the other species as well, they actually preferred being in the presence of other species. And this told us something about facilitation and interspecific interaction. So that was really interesting for me because here are all these species growing together. There's a lot going on in terms of interactions between them to boost their probability of occurrence. And that was something that I really wanted to continue after finishing my PhD, you know. So I thought, fine, I'll go back to Malaysia, I'll continue all this work, I'll look at resource translocation in response to burial, you know, I'll look at their spatial structure, I'll look at their environmental gradients. Then I got back to Malaysia. And the entire meadow where, you know, I had been studying for my PhD, which I had been monitoring every day and had a really close, I felt really invested in that meadow. I found that the entire meadow had disappeared because it had been replaced by a water palace. And when I say palace, I really mean it's a real palace. And this really spoke to me very deeply because I thought, well, this is a marine park. And this means that seagrasses here, even though they lie within the marine park, aren't really regarded very highly by our policy makers and our decision makers. So I thought, well, maybe it's time to actually look toward ecosystem functions and services instead of the type of work that I wanted to do. I looked at the attention indicators. I looked around and I thought, well, let's see if I have evidence that people here care more about coral reefs than seagrass. So I looked around what was happening in Malaysia. I looked at the yearly status reports, and I saw that for coral reefs, every year they have yearly status reports run by Reef Check Malaysia. We don't have anything like that for seagrass. What's the most current local report? For coral reefs, it's 2017 because it's yearly. For seagrass, the last time we had a national estimate of our meadows was 2008, 10 years ago. What's the most current regional status report for Southeast Asia? For coral reefs, through the really great synthesized work of the Global Coral Reef Monitoring Network, they get together every few years and come up with reports on the status of coral reefs in the region. So their last report was in 2014. What about ours in Malaysia? 2008, still again 10 years ago. What were the federal level grants that were given by the marine parks for coral reefs in relation to seagrass? Well, there were 9 grants given out. 7 of that were specific to coral reefs, either restoration, resilience, bleaching. Seagrass, 2 out of 9. And those 2 weren't even direct. It was like, okay, you can do connectivity for seagrass, for corals, but if you include seagrass, that's okay. It was that kind of a response. Are there mitigation or response plans? Yes, there were. Bleaching alerts. There's nothing like that for seagrass. Even when I found the meadows had declined last year, there wasn't really much of a response. Are there restoration plans? Yes, there are. For corals, but not for seagrass. So I thought, well, if I was desperately seeking attention for seagrass, what are elements I should have in my future projects? So I thought, okay, I should hitch my cart onto the coral bandwagon. I should look at human well-being in terms of food security and livelihoods because, well, marine parks in Malaysia are gazetted mainly because coral reefs are regarded as sanctuary for fish and seagrasses are slightly sidelined. So I thought, okay, let's look at human well-being. But there was another factor. I thought, you know, everyone really focuses on really cute things, the chomel factor. Chomel means cute or adorable. If you have a project that integrates one of that, a charismatic fauna, then you've got it made. In the projects that I was running, I didn't have any of that. So I thought, okay, let's try to tick the boxes for this for my next project. So we came up with a project called the Fish Habitat Project, where after speaking to people at the marine parks and various policymakers, I realized that the perception was because our meadows consisted of structurally small and simple species, we didn't have inhalers in these meadows. We didn't have Thalassia. So from their point of view, well, this can't be very important for fish. And when we dive there, we hardly see anything, so we stick to the coral reefs. Well, I thought, well, we don't really know for sure. So let's run a project on this and ask, how do the coral reefs that are right next to the seagrass compare to the seagrass in terms of fish communities? So we looked at diversity and abundance, and these are the variables. We look at economic groups in terms of what type of fish were getting caught there, were they used for aquaria, or were they used for commercial fisheries. We looked at habitat function in terms of juvenile density, adult density, because although in the literature it says that seagrasses are nursery grounds, but that wasn't the perception of our particularly simple meadows in Malaysia. And then we looked at habitat utilization. So we looked at whether the fish were grazing, did they exhibit the grazing behavior, or did they exhibit a protective behavior, or were they just passing through? So to collect all that, we put down quadrats, 2 meters by 2 meters, across an entire environmental gradient in coral reefs and seagrass. We set them in coral reefs that had different structure, from very simple to very complex. We did the same for seagrass, and looked at all the variables that were there. And what we found was, we sampled in July and September 2013, and April and September 2014. So this shows you the coral reef, and this is the mean fish density per meter square. This is for seagrass, and again, mean fish density per meter square. This doesn't really show you anything yet. This is just to show you when we were sampling and what the spread of the sampling points were. And then, mean fish species, you can see that in coral reefs, with mean fish species per meter square on the y-axis, we found 136 taxa. In seagrass, we found 86 taxa. So, okay, less fish taxa in seagrass, so 1 point for coral reef, fine. Then we looked at fish density, coral reefs and seagrass, mean fish density per meter square here. And we found significantly higher fish density in coral reefs, at which point my heart was like, oh, this is really nerve-wracking. Mean fish species, again, higher in coral reefs in comparison to seagrass. Okay, fine, 2 more points for coral reefs. We use all these measures because they are the measures usually used by the marine parks to compare between different coral reefs. And then we looked at fish family composition. And what we found for coral reefs and for seagrass here was that, yes, thank you, up to 70% of the fish family composition in coral reefs were dominated by fish such as wrasses, damselfish, and butterfly fish, whereas that same proportion was represented by a wider spread of families in seagrass, the breams, the emperors, goby fish, goatfish, blennies, and rabbitfish. So obviously there was a slightly more even distribution in terms of the dominant fish communities in seagrass. And I thought, okay, there is hope, after all, for seagrass. So diversity and abundance, obviously number of species, number of families. If you look at absolute number of species and families like most policymakers do, fine, coral reefs is higher, all of those. Fish density and fish species, okay, also higher in coral reefs. And then we continued looking at juveniles. We looked at mean juveniles per meter square. This is for coral reefs and seagrass. We had 6 times more juveniles in seagrass than we did in adults. And this was flipped for adults. We had 5 times more adults in coral reefs than in seagrass. So the proportions are these. For every 1 juvenile that you find in coral reefs, you find 9 adults. So that's a huge proportion of adults in there. And it's opposite in the seagrass. For every 1 juvenile you find in the seagrass, you have 0.3 adults. So okay, so this sort of fit with our perception of seagrass as potential nursery grounds. I wouldn't call this evidence for the meadows here to be nursery grounds because we didn't really sample the entire year, but it was certainly a compelling story to then bring to the marine parks. And then we looked at, we did a CCA on carnivores, omnivores, and herbivores. And you can see that they're really spread everywhere. You know, there's not much of a distinction here. There's only one herbivore in green there, which is your rabbit fish. And then we reanalyzed. This time we ran it with economic groups. So in red are the aquarium species. In blue are the commercial and minor commercial species. In the black triangles are the artisanal species. And then this came out very, very clearly. If you look at this, this is live coral cover percentage. This is seagrass cover percentage. All the reds mostly are towards the live coral cover. So all the species that were important for the aquarium trade were actually hanging out more in the live coral cover area. And most of the species that had commercial value to us, as table fish in particular, fish that humans were consuming for food, most of them were actually in the seagrass area. So something that was, we thought, rather interesting to bring to the marine parks. So if you look at seagrass and coral reefs, the top three most dominant in terms of frequency were all these really beautiful fish, like the damselfish and the butterfly fish. And because this is what people would say to us, I dive in a coral reef, I see so many beautiful things. I dive in the seagrass, I hardly see anything. And this is why, because most of the fish in seagrass were more cryptic. They were not as colorful, you know, and as flamboyant as fish in coral reefs. But you know what? They're the fish that puts food on our table. So this was a compelling story we could then bring to the Marine Parks Department. Then we looked at habitat utilization by fish. So from the videos, we counted the percentage, calculated the percentages of fish behavior. Were they grazing? Were they protecting, as in trying to scare away other fish from their surrounding areas? Or were they just passing through? And the interesting thing is, when you look at grazing, you find that in seagrass, 35% of the fish we observed were grazing, whereas this was flipped in coral reefs. 33% were actually protecting they were spending more time protecting their territory. So this told us that, you know, yes, maybe fish, the behavior of grazing in fish being higher in seagrass was telling us about the importance of seagrass as feeding grounds, and coral reefs were important areas as sheltering areas. So, what was the tally? If you look at economic groups, obviously commercial fisheries, the seagrass came up tops in our part of the world. The aquaria trade, yes, coral species were important. Artisanal, both were important. If you look at juvenile density, really significantly higher in seagrass meadows. If you look at adult density, more of that in coral reefs. If you look at whether they were grazing, hands down, seagrass. Protecting, okay, coral reefs. Passing through, both were obviously important. So for policymakers, they usually perceive coral reefs to be the main habitats, the main feeding grounds, the main nursery areas. And now we could actually bring this story to them to show them that, hey, you know, it's more balanced than you think they are. These are not substitutable ecosystems. They have a function, they have a role in different life stages of fish communities, and therefore we can't just protect one and gazette our marine parks only according to coral reefs while neglecting the rather more extensive seagrass meadows. So translating science into action, well, the student working on this, Nina Ho, who gave her presentation yesterday, she just submitted her thesis around 2 weeks ago and then came here. So now it's time to actually engage with the Department of Marine Parks, engage with the Fisheries Department to show them that structurally simple and small seagrass have their importance in terms of maintaining fish communities. And this has a bearing on livelihoods, and this has a bearing on the food that people get to eat in terms of food security. So, desperately seeking attention again. Fine, we've hitched our wagon onto the coral bandwagon, we've looked at human well-being, but we didn't have really anything very cute in this project. So although some people knew about our results, they weren't really particularly excited by it. Journalists would come to us and ask us, do you have a story? And I'll tell them about this. And they'll be like, oh, okay, it's fish. Anything cuter than that, like dugongs? So I was like, okay, fine. The chomel factor was missing from this project. So we started a project. with the Chomel factor, with a really adorable, really, the media darling. And this was for a project that we called the Dugong Seagrass Feeding Project. So dugongs are seagrass specialists. They're vulnerable on the IUCN Red List. There are no population estimates for Peninsular Malaysia, although Helene Marsh in the 1990s did come down to do aerial surveys with our fisheries department to confirm the presence of huge herds of dugongs in our waters. So they tick all the boxes in terms of how people feel about conserving an area based on the presence of these really iconic herbivores. We were really lucky because our interests also converged with the interests of dugong researchers working in Malaysia at that time. I mean, we would dive all the time in the seagrass meadow, and we would always notice a lot of feeding trails around, especially my experimental plots. So we told our dugong friends about them, and they said, okay, dugongs are obviously important there, let's run some projects on them. So our friend, a group of collaborators actually did some aerial surveys for 8 days in July 2010 just to confirm that dugongs were really there and to try to make population estimates. So if you look at this, this is Pulau Tinggi, this is Pulau Sibu. These are their aerial tracks because we didn't, and they went a long way because we didn't really know where the dugongs were congregating. And they plotted it out in a paper that was published later by Penampalam et al. 2015. And what we saw was that most of them were congregating around this area, Pulau Sibu. And although it looks like, they recorded a maximum of 20 individuals a day, and this sounds like very little, right, compared to Australia and Thailand. But for Malaysia, it was like, oh, such a big deal. It came out in the media, and it was really something that excited people. It captured people's attention because of the Chomel factor. And it was really exciting because 20% of the observations made by the dugong researchers consisted of mother and calf pairs. So obviously, there was something that was attracting them to that area. So we decided to look at the feeding trails in seagrass meadows. And we did this conceptually by trying to look at large-scale patterns of how they are feeding in order to find out what was driving hotspot areas for feeding in that area. So we looked at the seagrass meadow extent because we didn't really know how large the seagrass meadow was. We thought there were patches here and there, but we didn't really know how extensive they were. And then we look at patterns in feeding trails. We asked, are they clustered or are they dispersed or are they random? If they're clustered, then that makes them feeding hotspots. So what drives those hotspots? So from large-scale patterns, we tried to filter it down to understanding the processes that were occurring in that area. So we used the towed camera video that was on loan to us by Gary Kendrick and the University of Western Australia. Couldn't have done it without this. And if you look at this, we could actually make out dugong feeding trails in there. We did systematic sampling where we would stop the video frame every few seconds and to count how many dugong feeding trails were actually crisscrossing the area. These are our transect lines. If you look at this is Sibu Island, this is Sibu Tengah Island. These are our transect lines cutting across here. And this is about, to orientate your eye, this is about 9 to 10 kilometers from here to here. Took us hours actually. Took us 4 to 5 days to finish this set of transects. And what we found by plotting the seagrass absence and presence data was, of course, we found the dominant species for all this again. We could get the meadow extent, and with a meadow area of 16.5 square kilometers, most of the seagrass was more than 50% cover. Some was very close to 100% cover, lying within depths of 3 to 8 meters. When we looked at the feeding trails, the number of feeding trails that we counted at every sampling point, what we found in the histograms was really interesting. If you look at the feeding trail counts here and the frequencies here, and this is for June 2016, in June, we found more than 1,000 dugong feeding trail points. In October, this was 3 times less, only 490 dugong feeding trail points. But if you look at the histograms, they tell us a very compelling story. At every sampling point, the feeding trail counts were actually much lower in June compared to the feeding trail points in October. So although there were less points in October, the dugongs were actually feeding much closer to each other. So we wondered what was happening in terms of seagrass biomass. So we looked at the histograms of the seagrass biomass, and if you see in June, seagrass cover was much higher. Seagrass cover in October was intermediate, 25 to 50% was the mode, while it was 75 to 100% as the mode in June. And so in our imagination, our first hypothesis was that, okay, when seagrass cover is extensive, it's great, you know, there's a lot of biomass for dugongs around, they tend to feed maybe in a more spread out fashion. Whereas when seagrass cover declines and it gets thinner just before the monsoon season, the dugongs tend to feed closer to each other, with feeding trails happening closer to each other. Maybe they needed to compensate for the how do you call it, the decrease in biomass, and we were feeding really close to each subsequent feeding trail. So to confirm that, we came up with correlograms to look at the spatial order correlation of those feeding trails. If you look at this is distance from 0 to 2,200 meters, and again the same thing here. This is for June, this is for October. On the y-axis is your feeding trail order correlation. So this shows how correlated the values of feeding trails were at a certain distance apart. And the important thing to look for this here was to look at the ranges where the red line cuts the x-axis. So in June, you can see that they were autocorrelated at distances of up to 1,000 meters, so they were more spread out. In October, when biomass was lower, the autocorrelation was up to 400 meters, so they were eating in, you know, a rather clustered way over shorter distances, but more feeding trail points in that smaller area. But of course, there was no statistical significance, so this was just something that we tried to visualize just by looking at the correlograms. So we thought, okay, let's run Moran's eye. So Moran's eye is an index that tells us whether the dugongs are feeding in a clustered way, or in a dispersed way, or in a random way. And of course, we hope that they're actually eating in a clustered way, because then that means that there's a lot more interesting work for us to do. So Moran's eye lies between -1 and +1. If it's 0, it's random, then like we can, you know, all go home and not do any more work. If it's clustered, then yay, good. So Moran's eye that we calculated for June 2016 was 0.4, thank goodness, yes, okay. Moran's eye for October was 0.22, pretty weak, but still there was some clustering going on there, and this was significant if you look at the Z values. So what this told us was, yes, there was clustering in the way they were feeding. They were feeding probably preferentially in certain areas over others, and this was something that made us really curious about what were the processes driving that. Why were they eating in a clustered way? But Moran's eye doesn't tell us where the clusters were. So we reran the analysis, and this time with the Geddes odds statistic on maps that showed us where the hotspots were, and more interestingly actually, where the cold spots were. So the hotspots are areas where, if I have a huge number of feeding trails, let's say 8 feeding trails here, this calculation shows that neighboring points also have about equal high values of dugong feeding trails. So the red spots show us points where there are high feeding trails surrounded by neighboring points with equally high feeding trail counts. The cold spots were low values, where there were low values of feeding trails surrounded by neighboring points with also low values of feeding trails. So you can see in June, these are the hotspots, large, and these cell sizes about 400 meters across and 400 by 400 meters in size. These are the red ones show the hotspots. The white ones are not significant, so let's not look at that. And the blue ones show where there are cold spots. That's where the dugongs were actually not really happy to go and feed there. And in October, in approximately the same area, they were feeding in a very clustered, but in a smaller clustered way. So the hotspot was actually broken up in October 2016. and the cold spots were in approximately the same area. So then this started us thinking, so does that match with the seagrass percentage cover data that we saw? So if there's more seagrass, more biomass for them there, more percentage cover, why are they actually selecting just this area to feed in? And then in October, they come back to approximately the same area, you know, but they feed in a different way. They feed in small clusters. So why? But more interestingly, actually, I think, are the cold spots. These were areas that actually had very dense seagrass meadows. They had lots of syringodium, they had lots of cymadosia, but the dugongs didn't appear to be feeding a lot there. So we were curious about that. Why were they avoiding those areas? And there's certain explanatory factors. It could be because of seagrass biomass, it could be because of seagrass nutrition, it could be because of predation, for example. And these are some of the people who have been working on trying to find an explanation for why dugongs feed where they do. And to continue this work, we now will have to plot the seagrass biomass data against the hotspot and the cold spot areas in order to figure out whether there's a correlation between the amount of seagrass in an area as it goes through its natural cycle of increase and decrease. Does that mean the dugongs are also following that cycle as well? And what was happening to that population? So what was interesting about this research was, in trying to gain attention for seagrass, I found that it was really nice to find a synergy between the viewpoints of seagrass researchers and the dugong researchers. So the dugong researchers, because they were doing aerial surveys, were operating at a really broad scale over many islands. And if you look at the points that they plotted out, it was really very spread out. But with the work that we could do as seagrass geographers, mapping out feeding trails, we could zoom into specific areas where the dugongs were utilizing statistically in significantly higher ways than other areas. And I thought this was a really interesting synergy between people trying to call attention, one, to an animal that's endangered, and another one to a habitat that we think is lacking public attention. So to recap, what's the meadow extent? We found about 16.5 square kilometers of meadows. What were the patterns? The patterns in feeding trails, we found 3 times more trails in June, and that was, and we found 3 times less feeding trails actually in October, just before the monsoon season. When there was a high number of feeding trails, this coincided with higher seagrass cover. And yes, feeding was clustered. That means not all parts of the meadow were equal. There were some parts of the meadow that they actually really preferred to be in over others. They were feeding over longer distances in June compared to October. So were there feeding hotspots? Yes. But there were also seasonal overlaps. Were there feeding cold spots? Certainly yes, also with seasonal overlaps. And why? Why was this happening? Well, that was actually Harris Heng's talk yesterday, where he would go down in the hotspot areas and take lots of seagrass and sediment samples, go to the non-feeding trail areas and take lots of samples there and look at nitrogen, phosphorus, starch and fiber and so on and so forth. So this is the work done by Harris Heng, and although we don't have an answer to why yet they were feeding in a clustered way in these meadows, hopefully in a year or two we will have some answers for you. So translating science into action. For this project, we were really lucky. I mean, like, you know, with the fish habitat project that I talked about, we would approach people to talk about our preliminary results just to try to get some action going. And there was some interest, but not as much as this project. This project, even before we got results, people would come to us, do you want to say something about the dugongs and seagrass there? Do you want to give us an interview? There are people coming to us and we're like, but we don't even have results yet. So obviously, the Chomel factor seems to appeal to people more. When you have a charismatic fauna involved in a seagrass project, suddenly everyone wants to buy in. And it's not as if the dugong serves a specific function to them, it's just that they feel that I have to save this animal. So translating science into action for us was so much easier for this Dugong project compared to the fish habitat project. We worked 3 of our collaborators, which was Reef Check Malaysia, Mareset Research Organization, and Dr. Leela Rajamani, got grants from the UNDP GF Dugong and Seagrass Conservation Project. And the results that we had, we conveyed to them to be used in coming up with an island management plan, for example, by Reef Check Malaysia and the Department of Marine Parks Malaysia. For Mareset, they could understand the feeding ecology more. And for the Dugong Sanctuary zonation proposal by Mareset, they could actually come up with zones to look at which zones should be core zones for conservation for dugongs. Essentially, these are the areas where there are lots of feeding trails. Dr. Leela Rajamani came up with speed limit zones based on our seagrass maps. She went around talking to the local community to ask to consult them about, where should we place buoys so that we mark out the seagrass meadows so that when you travel by boat in those areas, you travel slowly. So it's a safe zone for dugongs based on the seagrass maps that we had. And I thought this was really interesting because the seagrass delineation map that we came up with was not the main reason we did this project. This was like just the first step. Okay, come up with a map that shows the seagrass boundary. And it doesn't fulfill any great academic or intellectual understanding of the seagrass. But the Dugong researchers got really excited about it and started to use it straight away and went around to the community showing them the maps to say, hey, we have seagrass here. This is a demarcation. So what do you say if we put buoys here and here and here? So the community could respond. So I was blown away. I thought something that's so simple and I thought potentially not really useful for them turned out to be really, really helpful in conserving dugongs. So what's the big picture? Lina Nordland and co-authors who came up with this Seagrass Ecosystem Services What's Next paper outlined a few steps that we can take in calling attention to seagrass. And they say, well, let's look at the variability of ecosystem services within and between seagrass meadows. We didn't do that, but at least now we've filled in the gap about structurally simple seagrass in the forereef meadow. And they also say, well, you should look at seagrass services in relation to other coastal habitats. And we were very happy because yes, okay, so we did the fish habitat community project to compare between coral reefs and seagrass. And we also have to improve communication about seagrass ecosystem services to the public, which we agree entirely with. But that's the hardest part for me as a scientist. I don't really know how to communicate about seagrass in a way that's entirely compelling to the public. But we hope that by improving our communication skills, we can turn people slightly away from coral reefs, although coral reefs are very important, we acknowledge that, but towards seagrass as well. I know because there's some coral reef scientists sitting in this room, one of whom is my husband. So, balance. So to give equal consideration to seagrass. But, having said that, even though my research in the recent years has moved temporarily towards ecosystem functions, there's something that concerns me, and that is that the legs that we are trying to give seagrass to stand on via ecosystem functions and services are not the legs of seagrass themselves. They're dependent on how people feel towards dugongs. They're dependent on how much money people feel they can get out of fisheries. So what happens? What about meadows that, for instance, meadows in Myanmar that were found recently to be faunally depopulated? What about meadows like that? What legs do we give them then? What about areas that, if we argue for blue carbon being important, what if those areas that have structurally simple seagrass aren't really important as carbon storage areas? Or what if they are, but the community doesn't really care about climate change issues because they're worrying about their daily bread and butter issues? So ecosystem functions and services, fine, this is a great way to call attention to seagrass. But is that the only way? There will come a time where we need to save a space at the table for meadows where scientists don't see any obvious ecosystem services, or else we lose those ecosystems as well. And with that, I'd like to thank the 2 students working on the projects that I spoke about, as well as our collaborators, Afendi, who led the coral team, Chong Vin Ching, who led the fish team, Louisa, who worked on the dugongs, as well as Gary Kendrick. Thank you so much for the loan of the toad video. It's still alive. Our interns and our volunteers. Thank you, everyone.
Yes. Thank you, Jill. I think that gave us all food for thought. We have time for questions, about 10 minutes, so any first takers? I can't tell if you're holding up. Oh, Catherine.
Thank you. Thanks, Jillian. That was a, loud microphone. That was a fantastic talk, and I was really interested by the patterns you found in the dugong feeding areas. And I was just wondering if you have any information about the temporal changes in the dugong distribution. Do you think the differences in the clustering of the feeding trails could be related to that?
Thank you so much, Catherine. We don't have data on dugong distribution because it was just so expensive for our collaborators to do their aerial surveys that we couldn't really tell where they were moving beyond that initial survey done in 2010 over 8 days. So it's really very patchy data, and it's just a snapshot over 8 days that happened 8 years ago. So yeah, short answer to that, we don't have the data for that. And that's why we did the dugong feeding trail counts. Because at least with dugong feeding trails, hey, I can see a feeding trail when I drag a camera through it, and I can count it, so at least I know the dugong is using that. But in terms of where they're moving apart from feeding, we don't actually know. Hopefully, our collaborators will do more boat surveys if they get more funding, and we'll be able to get a better idea of the correlation between the actual dugong population and movement patterns with where they are feeding.
Hello. Thank you very much. It's so fascinating for me. And I'm home from Vietnam. I have a question for you. So, like, if I someday go back to my country, and because there's no dugong in Vietnam, do you have any idea how can I attract the attention from the public? Because I don't have the story of dugong.
Oh, that's the $1 million question. Well, I guess if right now everyone's trying to call attention to seagrass meadows based on their ecosystem functions and services. So I guess if you don't have dugongs there, you're really sure there are no dugongs there.
Yeah,
oh,
yeah.
Man.
They just pass by like for vacation and they don't stay.
Okay. Well, I guess you have to find some other aspect of ecosystem services that you could work on in order to attract the attention of policymakers. Maybe, I don't know, shoreline stabilization, maybe blue carbon if you have larger species over there, more long-lived species. So I guess it depends on the ecosystem, and also depends what story you can get out of there in order to pursue. So yeah, we should talk more. I'm so sorry that the dugongs are not stopping by. Maybe they're all coming down to this area. I'll try to send them back up.
Thank you very much.
Maybe I can add a little bit about that. We recently showed that low structural seagrass meadows, even they provide very important ecosystem services. So even if you have, well, very tiny hair-like seagrasses, if you have the root structure intact, they are very important in protecting coasts. So that's one of the that can be a reason.
So even if they're small, they can protect the coast.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Anyone else?
Yes. Hello.
Sorry.
Hi. I thought it was a fascinating talk.
Since the topic that you were talking about was essentially about tackling coral blindness, and much of this is about convincing policymakers and local communities about the importance of seagrass in a world that is dominated by coral. I mean, I speak to some extent as a coral reef researcher.
Yes.
And I was wondering whether, I think everybody in the room will recognize that this is the false dichotomy, that it is impossible to really talk about seagrass meadows without talking about, and putting them as opposites is perhaps a wrong reframing of the problem. And do you think that there are ways in packaging these ecosystems as part of a collective, together with mangroves, together with with coral reefs, and with the sandy habitats nearby as well, and they're all part of important coastal and nearshore ecosystems that together give you the ecosystem services that you require to conserve. Do you think that there's a way to package that in a way that would tick all your boxes?
Thank you. Yes, that's something that has been weighing heavily on the minds of our entire lab, actually. And that's why, even though we do a lot of work on seagrass, we don't call ourselves the Seagrass Lab. We call ourselves the Coastal Ecosystem Team C Habitats. So we look at habitats as a collective unit. And although we did that coral versus seagrass project, which is a false dichotomy, I agree, and it was more to capture the attention of the policymakers at that time, I actually felt slightly uncomfortable with it, because that meant that we were saying, we are putting value on different ecosystems in a way that is very fragmented. I do acknowledge that we need to continue work such as this in connectivity. If we look at connections, connectivity studies between ecosystems, not just coral reefs and seagrass, but all the other coastal habitats, I think we have a stronger chance of helping our policymakers to look upon the coastal ecosystem as an entire unit, rather than being fragmented between coral reef and seagrass and mangroves or tidal flats. Right now, it is like that. It is very fragmented. And I think that connectivity studies are one way of doing it, and also for us to actually recognize ourselves as being marine habitats people, and that's something that I will actually have to think about a little bit more in the way I couch and the language that I use, the terminology that I use, and in the way that I frame my future studies. Thank you.
Yes, madam. I'm Shivakumar from Center for Advanced Studies.
Where is that voice? Oh, yes.
Yeah. Center for Advanced Studies in Marine Biology from India. And your aspects of translating science into action is very interesting. My appreciation to you. Mainly the seagrass and coral reefs, both are vital marine ecosystem, there is no doubt in that. But my understanding is that it should not be comparable, because seagrass is a habitat, but coral reefs are, rather than a habitat, it is a geomorphological structure. It could be able to form a nation. If you take Indian Ocean, Chagos Archipelago, Maldives atolls, Lakshadweep atolls, Aldabra atolls in Seychelles, if you take Pacific, Fiji group of islands, Tango, Samoa, all these group of islands and atoll nations, these coral reefs are capable of forming a nation or country. It is not comparable, coral reefs with seagrass. Both are vital component of the marine ecosystem. There is no doubt in that. It is my understanding.
Oh, yes.
Thank you.
I think it's the understanding of every person in this room as well. Thank you so much. But in trying to bridge the gap between our understanding of it, and with the understanding of policymakers who sideline seagrass, this was a first step towards at least trying to tell them that seagrasses are important as well. And I think that's why I said I think we should frame it in such a way that we're not saying it's a competition so much at the second stage of this project. In the first stage, we made it sound like a competition so that it's interesting for our policymakers, so that it captures their attention first, before we bring them up to the level of thinking in terms of entire habitats as single units. And you're quite right about that as well.
Gary has a question.
Oh.
When am I going to get my video back? No, that was a joke. Jillian keeps on saying she borrowed my equipment, but you've had it for 10 years. I think it's yours, Jillian. No, that wasn't my question. Thank you. It's good to see the sort of work you've been doing in an area that is really close to my heart. Well, I had the opportunity to work with you in this area. And at the time we were a little shocked at the lack of understanding or even the lack of appreciation of anything other than the coral reefs, which they didn't appreciate either, really, because I won't go into that, that's a different story. But the one thing I think you've shown here, it's in the narrative. If you get the right narrative across different groups in the society, you're able to get the message quickly and coherently out. I was very impressed that you actually got yourself onto national TV with the dugongs, and that was in Malaysia, and clearly dugongs and seagrasses were then in people's, their forebrain, and they were thinking about them, the dugong and dugong habitat. Did you do this deliberately, or was it just sort of some accident that occurred from the combination of your science? Do you have actually a plan for getting that narrative out?
You mean the video or the entire?
The whole entire thing.
It was deliberate. When I think it was in 2013 when I spoke to Louisa from the Mariset Research Organization, and that's a local NGO dedicated to the conservation of marine mammals in Malaysia. We were wondering how to bring our work together, and I told her, seagrasses are neglected. Can we use dugongs as a flagship species for seagrasses? And because of that, and she went on to get grants through her organization that we could support with our expertise about seagrass biogeography and feeding trail mapping to come up with that. So using the dugongs as a flagship species to call attention to seagrass was very deliberate. But I didn't expect the amount of media attention given to dugongs. I didn't expect for people to associate me with dugongs, which I was slightly uncomfortable with. I am a seagrass person. I'm doing this dugong thing temporarily to help our colleagues doing dugong work. But yes, it was deliberate in the sense that we wanted to use the dugongs as a flagship species. And I think it succeeded in a way. Yeah.
Hi, I have a quick question right here.
Where's that voice coming from? Oh, yes.
Oh, yeah. Great talk. It was really, really interesting. I'm actually working in Myanmar, so it was interesting that you mentioned that. But I wanted to know your initial fish project, where you found results for higher frequency of juveniles and commercially viable species in the seagrass beds. Did that have any traction in terms of policy change? Maybe it wasn't as, it didn't attract as much media attention, but did you find results from that? And if not, why? And do you have any insight into how we can better utilize that data?
The journalists were not interested in it. We spoke to them about it, and they asked for dugongs. Yes, so it was not interesting enough to the journalists. But after this, now that our student has submitted a thesis, we will be approaching the marine parks and the fisheries department directly to give them short, easy, and rapid presentations about what we found, so that if they can get on board with it, then there will be spillover traction towards all other strata of society, hopefully. And then maybe journalists won't turn us away from that project and ask for dugongs instead.
Yes, thank you so much for an excellent presentation. I think we've limited ourselves going after the natural resource managers as our next step in the chain of governance, being kinder to seagrasses. I don't think the coral reef people or the mangrove people did that. I think we should think about going into the Prime Minister or President's office. I think we should think about those who have the large budgets in the government, such as the roads department or infrastructure, ports, or whomever. And we should make friends with them and put our case forward that these are very important natural resources for the nation, and a plan should occur, just the way they plan the cities, they plan the roads, they plan the power plants. They should plan that the future be sustainable. I think we've been too myopic in our outreach for better governance of the seagrass, and I think we should bring international people in, like UNEP or FAO, somebody who has UNDP, GEF, who has real interest in this, to go to the Prime Minister's office or whomever with us after having pitched your elevator speech to UNDP, GEF, or whatever. I think we need a new plan of attack on the governments.
Yes, you're quite right, Anitra. I think that's why the Dugong project had a lot of attention as well, because it came through the UNDP, we were associated with the UNDP GF project, and they came in and there was a lot of media attention because of that. So yeah, so we have to increase our reach and talk more to politicians, I guess, although I'm not really good at that, but communication, right? So.
Thank you, Jillian. Well, I think, on that note, some politicians can be convinced. We definitely don't see dugongs in Singapore, but somehow our guest of honor was very enamored by Halophila ovalis. Would you all please join me in thanking Jillian? That was really inspiring, and I think it gave us a lot of food for thought.